Book 1, Chapter 5, Part 3 of History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1, by Henry Charles LEA. Book 1, Chapter 5, The Kingdoms of Aragon, Part 3. Meanwhile, in Saragossa, the Conversos were growing desperate. All peaceful means of averting the fate that hung over them had failed, and events at Teruel demonstrated the futility of resistance. The bolder spirits began to whisper that the only resource left was to kill an inquisitor or two, when the warning would deter others from incurring the hazard. They knew that secret informations were on foot, gathering from all sources testimony against them all. Inquisitor Arbues was almost openly said to be ready to pay for satisfactory evidence, and the life and fortune of every man was at the mercy of the evil-minded. Sancho de Paternoy, the Mistre Racional of Aragon, when on trial, admitted to prejudice against Juan de Anchias, secretary of the Tribunal, because he had inquired of a Jewish tailor whether Paternoy had a seat in the synagogue. Suspense was becoming insupportable. The project of assassination gradually took shape, and when the friends of the Conversos at the royal court were consulted, including Ferdinand's treasurer Gabriel Sanchez, they approved of it and wrote that if an inquisitor was murdered, it would put an end to the Inquisition. At first the intention was to make way not only with Pedro Arbues, but with the assessor Martin de la Raga, and with Micer Pedro Frances, and a plot was laid to drown the assessor while he was walking by the Ebro, but he chanced to be accompanied by two gentlemen, and it was abandoned. The whole attention of the conspirators was then concentrated on Arbues. Mistre Epila, as he was commonly called, was not a man of any special note, though his selection by Torquemada indicates that he was reputed to possess the qualities necessary to curb the recalcitrant Aragonese, and we are told that he was an eloquent preacher. He possessed the gift of prophecy, if we may believe the story that he foretold to his colleague Martin Garcia that he would reach the episcopate, for Garcia in 1512 became Bishop of Barcelona. But such foresight is not necessary to explain his reluctance to accept the inquisitorship, for, although this was always a promising avenue to promotion, the post was evidently to be an arduous one. His hesitation was overcome, and we have seen how energetically he commenced his new career. Yet the interruptions which supervened had prevented him from accomplishing much, and he fell a victim rather to fear than to revenge. The conspirators were evidently irresolute, for the plot was long in hatching, but the secret was wonderfully well kept, considering that the correspondence respecting it was extensive. Rumors, however, were not lacking, and as early as January 29, 1485, Ferdinand wrote to the governor of Aragon that a conspiracy was on foot, and that a large sum was being raised to embarrass the Inquisition in every way. Yet at the same time he thanked the jurats for their zeal in aiding the inquisitors. If suspicion was then aroused, it slumbered again, and for 6 months meetings were held without being discovered. It was determined to raise a fund for hiring assassins, and 3 treasurers were appointed. Juan de Esperandu, a courier, known as a desperate man, whose father had been arrested, undertook to find the bravos, and hired Juan de la Badia for the purpose. In April or May 1485, an attempt was made on the house where Arbues lodged, but the men were frightened off, and the matter was postponed for several months. At length, on the night of September 15th, Esperandu went to the house of la Badia and wakened him. Together they returned to Esperandu's, where they found the latter's servant, Vido Durango, a Frenchman, with Mateo Ram, one of the leaders of the plot, his squire, Tristanico Leonis, and 3 others who were masked and remained unknown. They all went to the cathedral and entered by the chapter door, which was open on account of the service of matins. Arbues was kneeling in prayer between the high altar and the choir, when the canons were chanting. He knew that his life was threatened, for he wore a coat of mail and a steel cap, while a lance which he carried was leaning against a pillar. La Badia whispered to Durango, "There he is, give it to him." Durango stole up behind, and, with a backstroke, clove his neck between his armor. He rose and staggered towards the choir, followed by La Badia, who pierced him through the arm, while Mateo Ram was also said to have thrust him through the body. He fell. The assassins hurried away, and the canons, alarmed at the noise, rushed from the choir and carried him to his house near by, where surgeons were summoned, who pronounced the wounds to be mortal. He lay for 24 hours, repeating, we are told, pious ejaculations, and died on September 17th between 1 and 2 a.m. Miracles at once attested his sanctity. On the night of the murder, the holy bell of Villela tolled without human hands, breaking the bull's pizzle with which the clapper was secured. His blood, which stained the flagstones of the cathedral after drying for 2 weeks, suddenly liquefied, so that crowds came to dip in it cloths and scapulars, and had to be forcibly driven off when he was buried on the spot where he fell. When the conspirators were interrogated by the inquisitors, their mouths became black and their tongues were parched, so that they were unable to speak until water was given to them. It was popularly believed that when in their flight they reached the boundaries of the kingdom, they became divinely benumbed until seized by their captors. More credible is the miracle reported by Juan de Anchias, that their trials led to the discovery of innumerable heretics, who were duly penanced or burnt. Pecuniarily, the affair had not been costly. The whole outlay had been only 600 florins, of which 100 was paid to the assassin. Like the murder of Pierre de Castelnau in Languedoc, this crime turned the scale. Its immediate effect was to cause a revulsion of popular feeling, which hitherto had been markedly hostile to the Inquisition. The news of the assassination spread through the city with marvelous rapidity, and before dawn the streets were filled with excited crowds shouting, "Burn the conversos who have slain the Inquisitor!" There was danger in the exaltation of feeling, not only that the conversos would be massacred, but that the Juderia and Moreria would be sacked. By daylight the Archbishop, Alfonso de Aragon, mounted his horse and traversed the streets, calming the mob with promises of speedy justice. A meeting was at once called of all the principal persons in the city, which resolved itself into a national assembly and empowered all ecclesiastical and secular officials to proceed against everyone concerned with the utmost vigor and without observing the customs and fueros of the kingdom. For some days the conversos continued to flatter themselves that with money they would disarm Ferdinand's wrath. They had, they said, the whole court with them, and the sympathies of all the magnates of the land. But they miscalculated his shrewd resolve to profit to the utmost by their blunder, and the consequent weakness of their friends. The royal anger, indeed, was much dreaded, and the Diputados, a few days later, wrote to the king reporting what had been done. The criminals had already scattered in flight, the city had offered a reward of 500 ducats, the judges had written to foreign lands to invoke aid in intercepting the fugitives, and both city and kingdom would willingly undergo all labor and expense necessary to avenge the crime. A proclamation was also issued, excommunicating all having knowledge of the conspiracy who should not within a given time come forward and reveal what they knew. It was probably in consequence of the murder that Ferdinand and Isabella succeeded in obtaining from Innocent VIII papal letters of April 3, 1487, ordering all princes and rulers and magistrates to seize and deliver to the Inquisition of Spain all fugitives who should be designated to them, thus extending its arms everywhere throughout Christendom and practically outlawing all refugees. No proof was to be required, simple requisitions sufficed. The surrender was to be made within 30 days and safe conduct assured to the frontier under pain of excommunication, and the penalties for fautorship of heresy. Fortunately for humanity, this atrocious attempt to establish a new international law by papal absolutism was practically ignored. There was one case, however, in which its punitive clauses seem to have been invoked. Several of the accomplices in the assassination found refuge in Tudela, a frontier city of Navarre, and on January 27, 1486, Ferdinand wrote to the magistrates there affectionately requesting that, if the inquisitors should send for the accused, all aid should be rendered, seeing that he had given orders to obey such requisitions throughout his own kingdoms. This application was unsuccessful, and in May he repeated it imperiously, threatening war upon them as defenders of heretics. The condition of the perishing kingdom of Navarre under the youthful Catherine and Jean d'Albret was not such as to protect it from the insults of a sovereign like Ferdinand, and the inquisitors presumed so far as to instruct Don Juan de Ribera, then in command of the frontier, to carry the royal threats into execution. That prudent officer refused to make war upon a friendly state without the protection of an express order bearing the signatures of Ferdinand and Isabella, whereupon on June 30th the inquisitors complained of him to the king. He was in Galicia, suppressing a rising of the Count of Lemos and reducing the lawless nobles to order, and from Viso, July 22nd, he replied that he would at once have sent the order, but that he had brought with him all the frontier troops. As soon as his task was accomplished, he would send back forces with orders to Don Juan to make war on Tudela in such fashion as to compel it to do what was requisite for the service of God. A letter of the same date to Torquemada states that the inquisitors have asked for letters of marque and reprisal against Tudela on account of Luis de Santangel, but this must be preceded by a carta requisitoria, which he instructs Torquemada to prepare and send to him when he will execute it. It was not until the end of November that the sovereigns returned to Salamanca, and it is presumable that the campaign against Tudela was postponed until the spring. Of course the fugitives had long before sought some safer asylum, but the papal brief of April 3, 1487, could be enforced against the magistrates, and they endured the humiliation of submitting to the Tribunal of Saragossa. At an auto de fe held March 2, 1488, the alcalde and 8 of the citizens appeared and performed penance. Ferdinand recognized the opportunity afforded by the assassination of Arbues and was resolved to make the most of it. Prominent among the means for this was the stimulation of the popular veneration of the martyr. On September 29, 1486, his solemn exequies were celebrated with as much solemnity as those of the holiest saint. A splendid tomb was built, to which his remains were translated, December 8, 1487. A statue was erected with an inscription by the sovereigns, and over it a bas-relief representing the scene of the murder. During a pestilence in 1490, the city ordered a silver lamp, 50 ounces in weight, to be placed before the tomb, and another silver lamp to burn day and night. His cult as a saint was not allowed to await the tardy recognition of the Holy See. The conspirators miscalculated when they imagined that his murder would deter others from taking his place. There was no danger for inquisitors now in Aragon, and the Tribunal of Saragossa was promptly remanned and enlarged for the abundant harvest that was expected. It was not long in getting to work, and on December 28, 1485, an auto was celebrated in which a man and a woman were burnt. The tribunal was removed to the royal palace fortress outside of the walls, known as the Aljaferia, as an evidence that it was under the royal safeguard, and Ferdinand proclaimed that he and his successors took it under their special protection. Strict orders were sent to the estates of the kingdom and to the local officials to suppress summarily all resistance to the confiscations, which were becoming so extensive that the receiver at Saragossa had his hands full and was empowered to appoint deputies throughout the land to attend to the work in their respective districts. In the prevailing temper, pursuit was hot after the murderers of Arbues, and the avengers were soon upon their track. There were some hairbreadth escapes, and much curious detail, for which space fails us here, will be found in the Memoria de diversos autos in the appendix, and some of it showing that there were powerful secret influences in favor of individuals. One party, consisting of the chief contriver of the plot, Juan de Pedro Sanchez and his wife, Gaspar de Santa Cruz and his wife, Martin de Santangel, Garcia de Moras, Mosan Pedro Mañas, and the two Pedro de Almazan, effected their escape by way of Tudela, for which, as we have seen, that city was held responsible, and the Lord of Cadreca, an ancestor of the Dukes of Albuquerque, was penanced for giving them shelter and receiving 60 florins in payment. Although by decree both secular and ecclesiastical courts were empowered to punish the guilty, the prosecution seemed to have been left altogether to the Inquisition, and it had the satisfaction of burning the effigies of the fugitives. Many, however, paid the penalty in their persons. Vidal Durango was soon caught at Lerida, when he made no difficulty in revealing the details of the plot and the names of the accomplices. The work of retribution followed, and was continued for years. In the auto of June 30th, 1486, Juan de Pedro Sanchez was burnt in effigy. Vidal Durango was treated mercifully, doubtless in consideration of his communicativeness. His hands were cut off and nailed to the door of the Diputación, or House of Diputados, and it was not until he was dead that he was dragged to the marketplace, where he was beheaded and quartered, and the fragments were suspended in the streets. The punishment of Juan de Esperando was more harsh. He was dragged while living to the portal of the cathedral, when his hands were cut off. He was then dragged to the marketplace, beheaded and quartered, as in the case of Durango. On July 28th, Gaspar de Santa Cruz and Martin de Santangel were burnt in effigy, and Pedro de Exia, who had contributed to the fund, was burnt alive. On October 21st, Maria de la Badia was burnt as an accessory. On December 15th, an auto was hastily arranged. Francisco de Santa Fe, assessor of the governor of Aragon and son of the great converso Jeronimo de Santa Fe, was fatally compromised in the conspiracy. Hopeless of escape, he threw himself from the battlement of the tower in which he was confined, and was dashed to pieces, and the same day his remains were burnt, and his bones, enclosed in a box, were cast into the Tagus, as though it was feared that they would be venerated as those of a martyr. Juan de la Badia eluded his tormentors in even more desperate fashion. An auto was arranged for January 21st, 1487, in which he was to suffer. In his cell the day before, he broke in pieces a glass lamp and swallowed the fragments, which speedily brought the death he craved. The next day his corpse was dragged and quartered, and the hands were cut off, and on the same occasion there were burnt in effigy as accomplices Pedro de Almazan the Elder, Anton Perez, and Pedro de Vera. On March 15th, Mateo Ram, who superintended the murder, had his hands cut off and was then burnt with Joan Frances, who was suspected of complicity, and the effigies of 3 accomplices, Juan Ram, Alonso Sanchez, and Garcia de Moras. August 8th, Luis de Santangel, who was one of the chief conspirators, was beheaded in the marketplace. His head was set upon a pole, and his body was burnt. Thus the ghastly tragedy went on for years, as the ramifications of the conspiracy were explored, and all who were remotely connected with it were traced. It was not until 1488 that Juan de la Caballeria was placed on trial. The wife of Gaspar de la Caballeria, having testified that her husband told her that Juan had offered him 500 florins to kill the inquisitor. Juan admitting having learned from Juan de Pedro Sanchez that there was a fund for the purpose, and that he had mentioned it to Gaspar, but concluded that Gaspar had not sufficient resolution for the deed. He died in jail in 1490, and his body was burnt in the auto of July 8, 1491, while Gaspar was penanced in that of September 8, 1492. In this latter auto Sancho de Paternoi, Ministro Racional of Aragon, was penanced with perpetual imprisonment. His trial had been a prolonged one. He had been repeatedly tortured, and had confessed privity to the murder, and had then retracted wholly, saying that he knew nothing about it, and that he had spent the night of the assassination in the palace of the Archbishop. His guilt was not clear. He had powerful friends, especially Gabriel Sanchez, Ferdinand's treasurer, and he was punished on mere suspicion. Any expression of satisfaction at the murder was an offense to be dearly expiated. Among the crimes for which Pedro Sanchez was burnt May 2, 1489, this is enumerated, and it was one of the chief accusations brought against Brianda de Bardaxi, but though she admitted it under torture, she retracted it afterwards. It could not be proved against her, and she was let off with a fine of a third of her property and temporary imprisonment. The assassination gave the Inquisition ample opportunity to make a profound impression, and it made the most of its good fortune. The Inquisition thus had overcome all resistance, and Aragon lay at its mercy. How that mercy was exercised is seen in the multitude of victims from among the principal Converso families, which were almost extinguished by the stake or by confiscation. The names of Caballeriya, Sanchez, Santangel, Ram, and others occur with wearying repetition in the lists of the autos de fe. Thus of the Santangel, who were descended from the convert rabbi Azarias Genillo, Martin de Santangel escaped to France and was burnt in effigy. Luis de Santangel, who had been knighted by Juan II for services in the war with Catalonia, was beheaded and burnt, as we have seen. His cousin, Luis de Santangel, Ferdinand's financial secretary, who advanced to Isabella the 16,000 or 17,000 ducats to enable Columbus to discover the New World, was penanced July 17, 1491. He still continued in the royal service, but he must have been condemned again, for, after his death, about 1500, Ferdinand kindly made over his confiscated property to his children, including 1,000 ducats of composition for the confiscation of Micer Tarancio. There was yet another Luis de Santangel, who married a daughter of Juan Vidal, also a victim of the Inquisition, and who finally fled with her to France, after which he was burnt in effigy. Juan de Santangel was burnt in 1486. Juan Tomás de Santangel was penanced August 12, 1487. A brother of Juan was the Zal Medina de Santangel, who fled to France and was burnt in effigy March 17, 1497. Gabriel de Santangel was condemned in 1495. Gisperte and Salvador de Santangel were reconciled at Huesca in 1499. Leonardo de Santangel was burnt at Huesca July 8, 1489, and his mother 2 days afterwards. Violante de Santangel and Simón de Santangel, with Clara his wife, were reconciled at Huesca. Micer Miguel de Santangel of Huesca was reconciled March 1, 1489. To estimate properly this terrible list, we must bear in mind that reconciliation involved confiscation and disabilities inflicted on descendants, which were almost equivalent to extinguishing a family. In 1513, Folsona, wife of Alonso de Santangel, petitioned Ferdinand, saying that her husband, Alonso de Santangel, 30 years before, had fled from the Inquisition, and his property had been confiscated, leaving her in poverty with 4 young children. She had withheld 80 libras of his effect and had spent them. Now her conscience impelled her to confess this and to sue for pardon, which the king graciously granted, with our customary clemency and compassion. One of these 4 children seems to be an Augustin de Santangel of Barbastro, son of Alonso, who as late as 1556 obtained relief from the disabilities consequent on his father's condemnation. There was in Aragon no Converso house more powerful than the descendants of Alazar Yusuf and his brothers, who took the name of Sanchez, and furnished many officials of rank, such as treasurer, bailey, dispensero mayor, etc. Of these, between 1486 and 1503, there were burnt, in person or in effigy, Juan de Pedro Sanchez, Miser Alonso Sanchez, Angelina Sanchez, Brianda Sanchez, Mosan Anton Sanchez, Miser Juan Sanchez, and among the Tamarit, with whom they were allied by marriage, Leonor de Tamarit and her sister Eulalia, Valentino de Tamarit and Beatriz de Tamarit. Of the same family there were penanced Aldonza Sanchez, Anton Sanchez, Juan de Juan Sanchez, Luis de Juan Sanchez, Juan Sanchez the jurist, Martin Sanchez, Maria Sanchez, and Pedro Sanchez. It is unnecessary to multiply examples of what was going on in Spain during these dreadful years, for Aragon was exceptional only insofar as the industrious notary, Juan de Anchias, kept and compiled the records that should attest the indelible stain on descendants. There is something awful in the hideous coolness with which he summarizes the lists of victims too numerous to particularize. The Gomez of Huesca are new Christians, and many of them have been abandoned to the secular arm, and many others have been reconciled. The Zaportas and Benitez of Monzon, many of them have been condemned and abandoned to the secular arm. End of Book 1, Chapter 5, Part 3.